I'm Jim Turk, the director of the Center for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University, and would like to welcome you to the first of the Center for Free Expression's first panels for the start of what is our 10th year. Before we begin, however, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which I am speaking to you is the territory of many nations: the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed by multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Finally, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for today's panel, the Canadian Association of Journalists and the Toronto Metropolitan University Journalism Research Center. We're appreciative of your support. With more than 100 media workers killed and few foreign correspondents allowed into Gaza, the ever-widening war in the Middle East has become one of the most devastating and yet most difficult to cover in recent years. To discuss the challenges faced by journalists, letting the world know what is happening in Israel and Gaza, we are privileged to have three remarkable journalists with us today, and I'd like to introduce each of them. The first is Akram Al Satarri. He is a freelance journalist in Gaza. When we last spoke with him, he was in Khan Yunis, and he has reported for the NBC, for Reuters, and for other outlets. We are having trouble today so far connecting with him, as is understandable because the issue of when you're in the midst of that terrible war zone, to have internet access to begin with, and then the issues of personal safety in the midst of the relentless bombardment. The second panelist is Gideon Levy. Gideon is an award-winning Israeli journalist, author, and eminent columnist for Haaretz. Welcome, Gideon.
Thank you.
Our third panelist is Tracy Seeley. Tracy is the Senior Director for News Gathering at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi. And our moderator is Julian Scher. Julian is an award-winning journalist himself, as well as an author. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Free Expression, and he's filmed documentaries in the Middle East and trained many journalists there. Welcome, Julian. Our format for today is Julian is going to lead the panel in a discussion of a variety of issues related to covering the war in Gaza. And that conversation is going to go on for about 45 to 50 minutes. And then we're going to turn to the audience to bring you into the conversation. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. The chat function is turned off in this version of Zoom, but the Q&A button allows you to ask questions. So as you're listening to the panelists discuss things and you have a question for an individual panelist or for the whole panel, just write it down, click on the Q&A button, write down your question. And when Julian turns to the audience for your input, the questions in order will be read to Julian and the panel by Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the Center for Free Expression. But please write down your questions as they come to mind over the course of the conversation. Don't wait till we turn to the audience to do so. I think that's all I have. So over to you, Julian.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you everyone for joining us to discuss what is a difficult war, a devastating war, and many, many people around the world have personal connections to what's going on. As we're talking, I am frantically trying to reach Akram on WhatsApp, and we hope that he is safe. In his absence, I want to read something he has already said about his work. Akram says, we as journalists are change agents. We are hoping that by comprehensive coverage of Gaza, even if it means losing our lives, we are ready to go the extra mile for the sake of helping the people. And let me also, in his absence, read you from today's Committee to Protect Journalists in New York, the most respected media rights organization probably in the world. Their current official number is 116 journalists killed, which makes it by far the deadliest conflict in the history of the CPJ gathering data. They specifically named 5 journalists directly targeted by Israeli forces in which the CPJ classifies as murders. That's their word, not mine. Quite harsh. And let me quote from their program director: since the war started, journalists have been paying the highest price, their lives, for their reporting. Every time a journalist is killed, injured, or arrested, or forced to go into exile, we lose fragments of the truth. And I hope we can reach Akram. I hope he is safe. And I think he will echo those words and tell us of last time we spoke to him when the panel was preparing for this. It was quite chilling. Tracy and Gideon will remember the camera came on. It was dark. We could barely see him. Then his face appeared in silhouette. He was in a tent. He went outside and we saw some pictures of some children playing outside under a single light, and then the connection cut off. Gideon, let me start with you while we await Akram. You've been quite openly critical of the war from your column in Haaretz. Where do you get your information on this war? And related to that, how well informed do you feel your fellow Israeli citizens are on this war?
So I tell you, Julian, that where from I don't get my information. I don't get it from Israeli TV. I don't get it from the main Israeli newspapers. I don't even get it from most of the social media in Israel. Israel is turning its back toward Gaza, and the Israeli media does not show anything and does not tell anything. The Israeli media is preoccupied with the victims, the Jewish Israeli victims, with the brave soldiers, with the hostages. In many ways, we are still stuck in the media on the 7th of October, again and again, the same stories about the atrocities of the 7th of October, endless stories about what happened then, and nothing about the Suffer of Gaza, nothing about its destruction, the mass killing. You see nothing. And we journalists know that it's all about framing. And the framing of the stories which still penetrate to the Israeli media are always covered with a cover of dehumanizing the Palestinians and always presenting them, all of them, as terrorists. I will give only one example so people would understand what do I mean. 2 weeks ago, Israel had bombed a school in Gaza, and dozens of Palestinians were killed, including children. Horrible scenes, really from the worst scenes we saw in this war. It was main news, I guess, almost all over the world. It opened the news magazines. It was main headlines almost all over the world, except of one place, Israel. I picked up the biggest Israeli newspaper, Yediot Ahronot. There was nothing in the front page about it, even not mentioned in a sentence. Deep inside the newspaper, you could find a small piece of information that dozens of terrorists were killed yesterday in Gaza. That's it. No images, no talking about the innocent people who were killed, nothing about the children. And this is going on systematically ever since the 7th of October. No censorship, no pressure from the government or the army, just commercial considerations of the free Israeli media. Namely, they know what the readers and the viewers want to get, and they don't want to bother them. And the outcome is really a betray in our democratic mission, not less than this.
Gideon, we had a panel last year with Russian journalists where they were facing, of course, a lot of repression and laws that actually made it illegal to report the truth about what was going on in the war in Ukraine. But that's not the case in Israel, right? You don't have severe laws or crackdowns. The media is quite free and open.
But that's exactly the point. This makes the media much more responsible to the betray because it has the freedom. In Russia, they don't have the freedom. In Israel, they have the freedom, and the outcome is almost the same. And in many ways, the Israeli media does something much worse than the Russian one, because here it is about self-censorship because of populistic considerations. And this, in my view, is unforgivable much more than a media that has to follow the instructions of the government. Because to this self-censorship in Israel, there is no resistance. They all do it with great joy. They believe that propaganda is journalism. They believe they are journalists. They believe that in times of war, the Israelis should get only selective information. They believe that the role of the media is to keep the people united, that the media has to keep the morale of the people high, that the people should not see everything that is being done by Israel because it might create some moral question marks, and in times of war, there is no room for this. So this, in my view, is much worse than the Russian way.
I will come back to you and look at some of the personal costs and the challenges that you face for espousing views that are often quite unpopular in your own country. Tracy, for many people watching this, of course, either in Canada or around the world, they know that there are no CBC correspondents, official correspondents inside Gaza or other Western reporters. So how do you, as a news gatherer for the most important media outlet in Canada, get reliable video footage and information? And of course, keeping in mind you may have to withhold some security details, but what procedures are you taking to getting the real news out of Gaza?
It's a good question, and it's been an incredible challenge for our teams. Just for clarification, I'm humbled in the company that I'm in with Gideon and hopefully soon Akram, but I'm not a field journalist anymore. Just for clarity for your audience, I'm in charge of our field journalists, and so we have a challenge. On the positive front, we have a lot of expertise with really experienced journalists who were based in the Middle East or who had been there for stories for years and years. Margaret Evans, our senior international correspondent, Sasha Petrasik, who we've now sent back to Jerusalem temporarily. And so we drew on everyone and all of their contacts, all of their expertise immediately when this latest conflict began. But for all of them, of course, not actually being able to be there is so difficult. And so what we have done is we've worked to find a reliable journalist inside Gaza, a videographer. His name is Mohammed El Saifi. And we have, not right from the beginning of this particular conflict, but shortly afterward, really established a good relationship with him. He's very dedicated. We're working with him regularly. And we have a writer, Yasmin Hassan, who is working directly with him, telling the stories that he gathers in Gaza. So it's a bit of a unique situation where we have a freelancer working with someone in Canada, and then we deploy teams into the region from from other parts of the world, London and Washington, where we have correspondents based. But it's challenging both because of not being able to actually be in Gaza, but also, to be frank, because we did close our permanent bureau in the region, you know, at the end of 2018, I believe it was. So we hadn't had a constant presence in the region for some time. So that exacerbated things too.
Which leads me to my next question. I mean, the videos and audio that we're now seeing on CBC are coming from your stringer, and he's working with an Arab-speaking journalist back in Toronto. But even before the war, would you agree that there was almost a built-in North American bias, because we're largely English-speaking operations? We have English-speaking correspondents who, when they were in the Middle East, tend to be based in Jerusalem. And so we're not getting the human stories from many of the Arab countries or from Arab-speaking people. So how much what efforts have you tried to make to overcome that obstacle?
It's a really good question. And we certainly, you know, as our staff became more diverse, and, you know, we've got a long way to go on that front, but we're in a better place than we were years ago, including within our leadership teams. You know, the gaps in perspective in our coverage were, you know, were made very clear to us. And we have been addressing long before October 7th, the fact that we were missing perspectives for sure in how we approached the story. We've had a variety of different people over the years, you know, who've been based in other places. Nal Ayed, now a very long time ago in Beirut, and Radio Canada actually maintained a bureau in Beirut longer than we did, but it's a constant.
I think we lost your video, Tracy.
Oh, sorry, I talk with my hands. That'll probably happen again. I hit my keyboard. So yeah, I think our biggest challenge really is we need to be there and covering as many perspectives as we can, and we're aiming to do that right now.
And it's not easy. I'm still trying to reach Akram. I keep poking him on WhatsApp. I hope dearly he's okay. I have to admit that I have colleagues and friends who know journalists who have been killed and injured covering the war in Gaza. I would have wanted Akram. Let me again quote from him, where he talks about getting up in the morning and starting the day with different incidents. He talks about trying to get to a site where he's covering the war, either on foot or, believe it or not, in an animal-pulled cart. That's the kind of efforts he makes. I also would want to talk to him about the difficulty of dealing with Hamas in a war zone where there's been a lot of repression and the lack of a free press. So let's hope he is safe and he could join us. Gideon, I'd like to both of you move to a second theme, which is the personal toll and costs. All wars, of course, are emotional and personal, but I think this war, certainly for people in Israel and Gaza and around the world, has been quite gut-wrenching and heart-wrenching. Gideon, it's no secret, you are not very popular among many of your fellow citizens. You have faced death threats. What has it been like since October 7th for you to take the positions and some of the exposés that you've been trying to do? What personal cost has it been for you?
So the 7th of October was really a turning point in Israeli public opinion, including my best friends and even members of family who really changed their minds after the 7th of October. It's not like before the 7th of October, most of the Israelis would see eye to eye with what I write or say. But after the 7th of October, I became much, much more lonely. hard, even in my own newspaper, I must say, which always supported me and still supports me, but this intimacy, this ability to share values and views, at least with some people who are close to you, I quite lost it. I'm really much more lonely. In the streets, it's always unpleasant for me, and but it's not violent, I must say. In 2014, I had in my newspaper two bodyguards to guard me. I don't see any need this time. Here and there, people shout at me, but really, it's really reasonable. I don't want to have the feeling that I'm a martyr or something like this. By all means, not. And there are always also the supporters who become now even more dedicated. But by the end of the day, it's very hard to raise your voice now, not because it's dangerous, but because you can feel that nobody agrees, nobody is ready to hear, nobody is ready to pay any kind of empathy to the Palestinians, to the suffer, to the sacrifice, to the children, to the parents. Nothing is really penetrating, nothing is stretching the skin of most Israelis who really lost any signs of humanity. It's unbelievable what happened to these people. Not that it was a great situation before, but after the 7th, really, it's so hard to touch. You bring the most horrible stories, and they will always say, yeah, but there was the 7th of October. And with this, you cannot really deal. I cannot deal with it.
I want to push more on the personal aspect because I think it's important for the many people watching to understand that you know, journalist, yes, you try to do your job as a columnist or as a director of news gathering, but there's a personal toll. So Gideon, how do you keep from despair? You've been crying these making these cries for years and years, but it's gotten much more intense. How do you not get frustrated? How do you not get full of despair? I guess, why don't you give up?
Who told you I don't get totally despaired? Who told you I'm not frustrated? Sure I am, and more than ever. But what choice do I have? I mean, I will not change my mind. I will not stop to raise my voice because that's my duty. That's my job. That's the meaning of my existence, and I will continue with it. Don't forget that Haaretz has this special characteristic that it is translated simultaneously. I mean, Haaretz and my articles in special are all translated into English on the same day.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, around the world, it's the opposite phenomena because there is thirst for getting some other voices from Israel, for getting some kind of signs of humanity from Israel, some kind of understanding what Israel is doing, some kind of moral judgment to what Israel is doing. So in many ways, my writing is now much more effective and much more aimed at the readers overseas. And I'm very grateful to them because they are sending a lot of appreciations. And it's not about their appreciations. I think also that politically, the arena is now the international community because Israel will not change. The only chance is that the international community will put itself like it did with South Africa and make Israel change. The change will not come from within Israel, no chance.
A point I want to pick up on when we look at the future, Tracy. It is rare that people know that I'm a former CBC staffer for many years, and it's rare I would ask another CBC person a personal question. But I think most people see the CBC as monolithic, the same way they see the CTV or the Star or the Globe and Mail. But of course, that's not the case. And it's been no secret since the war began in Gaza that there have been, I think, an unprecedented level of tension inside CBC. Between Jewish and Arab and Muslim staff and people of different political persuasions. So I'm going to ask you how unnerving has it been as a news director, and what is CBC doing to grapple with this unprecedented situation inside your own newsroom?
It is such a tough question. To find the right words, I certainly have not seen anything like it in the almost 30 years I've been doing this. And yeah, I think it really has challenged people so personally that even in this newsroom where, we've covered a lot of things, over a lot of years and tackled things that people didn't agree with, or, debate and discussion, even yelling and, normal. This is different. It's so, it's almost the silence has been problematic. You hear silence at times where you want people to be sharing their different points of view and enriching each other's understanding that way. But it has been really hard. So as a manager, we're still working on that. I think we are doing good work, and we have rebuilt some expertise with the story that had been lost in the years where we hadn't been covering it as much. And again, grateful for all the correspondents who are such a foundational strength for all of our teams who are less knowledgeable about the story. But yeah, it's the personal side of it for people is a challenge. So we are really trying to get to the basics of trying to figure out how to bring people together to talk to one another when they don't have the same opinions. And it sounds so basic, but this is where we are. And it's kind of at the absolute core of trust, which is what we're all about. We have to have that trust, or how can we ask our audience to trust us? So we're still working on it, is a long answer to your question, Julian. It's a tough one.
But those tensions, and a lot of that has flared up in the open inside CBC, and I'm sure in other media, are obviously a reflection of the tensions inside wider society. And it's no secret that CBC is, how do you deal with the criticism from quarters saying that, there's a bias against Palestinians on the word like massacre. Massacre is used for October 7th, but not for the more than 40,000 people killed in Gaza. And the reverse side, many Jewish groups in Canada and around the world feel that the media is playing into anti-Semitism in a lot of its coverage. So those views, I'm sure, are reflected inside your staff. How do you grapple with those harsh criticisms?
Yeah, well, we listen and we hold ourselves accountable to answer those questions. We get complaints, for an example, from the independent ombudsman, where we have to respond and defend our coverage. And we get a lot of complaints from all sides. And there are times when we're defending coverage that doesn't need to be changed. And there are times where we realize, maybe our choice of words, we have to really think differently about how, the specificity of the words that we're trying to use, because that, of course, is at the heart of it all, being specific, attributing, making sure we're clear about what we don't know. And it's certainly in a situation where you're not in the place where the thing is happening, you have to be so transparent about what you don't know. So again, we are constantly working on it, constantly challenging ourselves, our JSP, Journalistic Standards and Practices team that receives the complaints. And, they challenge us like the audience, have you really thought about your approach with that particular story? And you think to yourself, well, even if that wasn't a mistake, we could do that better next time. So we're accountable. And that's something we all take extremely seriously with all
I guess what
stories. But this one, this one is perhaps, among the most challenging of them all.
But I guess part of what you're saying is that these are active decisions. Your CBC's approach is changing based on internal discussions and outside criticism. That there's not a hard line that's fixed, and you are trying to grapple with a fast changing situation.
Yes, absolutely. We have active discussions all the time about decisions. It is not a dictatorship where we've, decreed that this, is the way we're going to do X thing. We do, we have standards, we have to uphold them. But when we need to challenge those decisions, we talk about it. Our staff do come, and challenge us too. And so it's an ongoing discussion. That part of things is still an active, healthy journalistic activity, I would say, with this story. It keeps us, we have to be very sharp on all of it.
No word from Akram. I keep texting him on WhatsApp. I do hope he is safe. If you're just joining us, or if you're catching up, we are trying to reach our Palestinian journalist from Gaza who's worked for Democracy Now!, NBC, and Reuters. One question I would have put to him here when we're talking about the personal cost, Gideon talked about the burden on him. Tracy talked about some of the internal turmoil and discussions about journalism inside CBC. But obviously for Akram, it's not only his personal safety, but there have been reports of journalists, a well-known journalist from Al Jazeera Arabic who was reporting and then on air finds out that his family has been killed. How do journalists like Akram continue working and try to be dispassionate and get at the truth when they're seeing their loved ones suffer? How do they deal with an organization like Hamas? How do they deal with the IDF? These are not easy issues. And I should note, again, in Akram's absence, that the Committee to Protect Journalists notes that the International Criminal Court, as people know, has seeking arrest warrant applications for Hamas and Israeli leaders for war crimes. And the CPJ notes that journalists are civilians and are protected by international law, and deliberately targeting civilians, I'm quoting them, constitutes a war crime. Let's hope that our colleague Akram is safe. I want to end our chat here, and before we move on to opening it up to questions from the audience, by looking at the future. It's impossible to have a crystal ball on such a wide-changing war, and of course, we're all reading the news and following the news about the events in Lebanon and of course Iran. Gideon, from your point of view, let's imagine that somehow there's some kind of stable ceasefire, some kind of end, at least to the daily bloodshed. But that still would leave a devastated Gaza and a politically torn Israel. How do you see things changing inside Israel for you as a columnist and the media?
It's very hard to see a positive change within Israel, as I said before. There is no scenario in which I can even imagine a positive change, because it's always a wall-to-wall agreement among Israeli public opinion that whatever we are doing in Gaza is justified, that we have the right to do whatever we want after the 7th of October, that there are no legal limits and no moral limits, that the Palestinians deserve it, that the people of Gaza deserve it, including the babies, including the women, including the children. It is so deep-rooted right now that it's very hard to see a change, at least not in the coming future, especially when the media is playing such a shameful role in inciting Israel, in dehumanizing the Palestinians, in not covering the crimes, and in creating a situation in which the media is the conductor of Israeli patriotism and Israeli nationalism and racism. To break this is almost impossible. The only hope, as I said before, is from the international community. Only international pressure will make a change politically, socially, morally, and also the media, because one should understand that it's not like all the Israeli journalists are right-wingers and racist and the Arab haters. Not at all. It's something much more worse than this. They are populists and opportunists and cowards. And once they will feel there is a better atmosphere, you will see them all getting back to their so-called leftist position. And the media will change. Right now, they adjust themselves to the market, if I can say so, to the requirements of the market, to the desires of the market. And the market is now in a very, very bad shape. Namely, it wants revenge. It hates the Arabs. It doesn't believe in any settlement with the Arabs. It wants to see them bleeding as much as possible. Some of the Israelis, not the majority, but not a tiny minority, are even happy about the suffer of Gaza. You see it in social media. People are celebrating children being killed. People are celebrating destruction. So in this atmosphere, really to hope for a better reality is very hard, unless the international community will get into the picture, not in talkings, because this we had enough, not in threats, not in advices, not in condemnations. This is totally hollow, only by actions. And then it might create a change.
Gideon, you were one of the people who spoke out against the shutting down of Al Jazeera and their Jerusalem bureau, a move that, regardless of what you think of Al Jazeera, was roundly condemned by media organizations around the world. At the same time, I'm wondering if you feel there is your equivalent in the Arab media. The Israeli media has its critics and its columnists, especially in Haaretz and elsewhere. Are you finding those critical voices in the Arab media as well? And will they increase at all in the future?
The answer is, but the expectations are different. Israel is the darling of the West. Saudi Arabia is not the darling of the West. Nobody thinks that Saudi Arabia is a lighthouse for democracy and freedom. But people claim that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And if so, it has a price. And you expect more from the only democracy in the Middle East. So, first of all, this symmetry is irrelevant. What, Syria and Israel? Yes, in Israel it's much better. So, does it mean that it is a democracy by all parameters? No, but nobody claims that Syria is. Nobody claims that Yemen is. Nobody even claims that the PA or the Palestinian Authority is a democracy. So this comparison is biased by definition. And then, about the Palestinian journalists, how can you judge them when they are functioning under a very, very brutal occupation? I mean, in the last 7 months, this is another phenomenon that we should pay attention to. Israeli Palestinians with Israeli passports, Israeli citizens were arrested and fired from their jobs because of any kind of paying any kind of empathy with Gaza. If you say something about the suffer of Gaza, you might find yourself arrested if you are Palestinian. If you're Jewish, you can say whatever you want. But if you're an Israeli Palestinian and those things happened on a daily basis, teachers, headmasters were fired from their jobs because they said a sentence about the suffer of the children of Gaza. This is not legitimate in Israel today. So, to praise Israeli democracy is one thing, but if you are judged according to those cases, not according to Haaretz, which is really an island of democracy and freedom of speech. But finally, you have to judge Israel according to the other extremes, to the places where people go to jail because they paid empathy or sympathy to the Palestinian children. This defines Israel. This that we have also some liberals and some institutions like Haaretz, which is really internationally recognized as a very brilliant and professional newspaper, and rightly so, very rightly so. But this is not Israel.
Tracy, let me end with you, since you're the person who's helping to bring the news to many people watching this. You know that the Western media tends to quickly forget the last war and move on. Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, now Gaza. Will this happen again with the Gaza war and the Middle East, or will this time be different?
When I think the news business has always been unpredictable, but the last few years have been off the charts unpredictable. And as our business is in a volatile time. And so we have, like many organizations all over the world, had to make some difficult decisions, including the one to have closed our Middle East bureau. We're committed to covering this conflict, this war. And I can't predict the future. We are committed to covering the Russia-Ukraine war too, except this war starting did affect our ability to do that. We can't do everything all the time in the same way maybe we could have in the past, or I imagine we could have in the past. So we have to, it's a difficult one. I will say we will continue covering this story differently than we have in the past. It's not, one solution. Like this situation with Mohammed in Gaza has actually, I think, opened our eyes to possibilities that we can do in other places, really building on the experience that local journalists have and the expertise that local journalists have in places where we can't go for different reasons. So we're going to draw lessons from this, and I can't predict what our coverage is going to look like, but we're going to be in the field as much as we possibly can, as close to that story as we possibly can get. And as soon as we can get into Gaza, we would want to be among the first in.
I also heard that there's some election south of the border that might draw some resources.
Yes, that little thing. Yes,
little story
exactly. There's a lot going on.
But I think that's a good point to end on the formal part with our panelists about Gideon and you both signaling some of the lessons learned by the media in these last few months, and the challenges that lie ahead. I would have liked to hear, of course, from Akram. And let me say, this is unprompted, but perhaps, as Jim will explain, this whole discussion will be posted on YouTube. And perhaps if I can reach Akram in the next few hours or days, we could do a short interview with him going through these issues, and we'll post it on the same YouTube page with this panel. We're going to go to questions. Ange has been gathering questions that people have sent in, and I would encourage our viewers, our live viewers right now, to send in any other questions. Ange, can you give us our first question?
Yeah, and I do want to remind attendees, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask a question at this point. The first question is for Gideon. Gideon, you've described the practice of the Israeli media in providing little or no coverage of what Israel is doing in Gaza, other than that which supports the government's narrative. Haaretz the newspaper of which you are a columnist, seems to be an exception. Can you share how it came to be an exception?
Yes, it's a long history. First of all, Haaretz is more than 100 years old, and it always played a different role. It was always critical at the government, no matter what government it was. It was always critical about the occupation. It was always critical about the apartheid. It is very interesting because it's a real liberal newspaper in the way that in economical questions, it's much more liberal, which means right-wing. And on the political issues, it's much more leftist, namely for peace and ending the occupation, question like this. But still, it is defined by its publisher, from my point of view, unfortunately so, as a Zionist newspaper. And it is a Zionist newspaper. And one shouldn't be mistaken about it. It is a Zionist newspaper, even though I don't consider myself a Zionist anymore. But it is not the newspaper of the masses. It used to be the newspaper of the elites. It is still the newspaper of the elites, even though the elites changed in Israel. And I guess the new elites are reading less Haaretz. But on the other side, we have now the online edition, which brings us all kind of new readerships in big quantities. We have paywalls, but still you get different voices, many more right-wingers who read us because they want to know the enemy. And by the end of the day, it has its influence still. And mainly the influence is on other media because Haaretz in many ways is forcing, not always and not enough, but is forcing other outlets to deal with certain subjects. I'm not speaking only about the occupation, but mainly the occupation, but not only. Many topics are totally ignored by the other media, like, for example, the asylum seekers in Israel. Nobody cares about them. Haaretz is the only outlet which really covers them and gives them a voice. And in many ways, it forces the other ones also to deal with it, at least as a lip service. So Haaretz is different from day one. It was always a different newspaper. The problem is that the other newspapers and TV stations went much more to the right. Haaretz stayed in the same place, but all the others went much more to the populist, right-wing, nationalistic, vulgar also, emotional. Many times you see news and you understand it's not news, it's an entertainment show. It's a lot about emotions. Any emotion sells newspapers. Any emotion brings ratings. So you see everything is covered with all kind of sentimental, emotional covers, really very annoying. And Haaretz remained the same Haaretz like 100 years ago. But today, Haaretz looks so much more different than it used to be 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Gideon, if I could ask you a follow-up. When Trump became president, and in many ways in this campaign, we saw what was called the Trump bump, where the Washington Post and the New York Times and other media who were increasingly critical of him had a huge surge in subscriptions and therefore revenue. I don't know if you have access or if it's public, but since October 7th, has Haaretz become more popular, less popular? What are the numbers like?
I can tell you it almost doubled its readership overseas, but
Overseas?
only overseas. And that's very regrettable because finally we are an Israeli newspaper aimed, first of all, to the Israeli society. And here I can't say there is an increase, by all means not. There's also no decrease, fortunately. But the main increase is overseas, yes.
Wow, double overseas though.
Almost
Interesting.
double, yeah.
And next question.
Yeah, the next question is from George, and George says the ICC and the ICJ has clearly identified the human rights issue involved with respect to Israel's behavior, and yet we continue to hear both siderisms. This seems like an editorial choice. To what degree do the publishers lean on writers to frame stories?
Tracy, I guess you could try to tackle that.
Yeah.
Can you repeat that last part of the question? What did he mean?
To
To what degree?
what degree do the publishers lean on writers to frame stories?
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's their pressure by news managers to get the writers to talk about both sides. All right, Tracy?
Yeah, we have a process that news managers aren't involved in, just the writing, vetting, process that every reporter has to go through with whichever program or platform they're filing a story to. And so it is rigorous. People are challenged to back up what they're reporting, but I think what the question is getting at is do we try to slant things one way or the other, either our editorial leaders or managers? And I would say we don't. But people have to be able to back up their journalism and when they do their stories, and there's a process that they go through when they do them. So we report that way.
I don't work at the CBC or any other official media organization anymore, but obviously I follow what's going on quite closely. And I think the question is a good one, this notion of both sides. And if we could again turn to our American colleagues and what they've been dealing with, again with the Trump phenomena, and there was quite a lot of criticism of making both sides equal. And it took time for the media to call lies, lies, and to call racism, racism. And I think the best answer is, I think many of my colleagues at the CBC, but certainly in other media as well, realize that you have to be factual, you have to be accurate, and being fair doesn't mean giving both sides in every story and in every article. It's your overall coverage. So we're seeing some amazing, heartfelt reporting direct from Gaza, the suffering going on. And it doesn't mean in that article you have to talk about the October 7th attack. It means the
Yes.
thrust of your coverage has to be fair, but fair also means giving balance to the scale of the tragedies. So if you're
Absolutely.
dealing with tens of thousands of casualties on one side, that has to be handled. But I also think, to Tracy's point, and even to Gideon's point, it's really important for people to understand that inside Haaretz, inside CBC, inside every media, there are huge debates, huge yelling and screaming over coverage. So it's not easy. And
I'll
next
just add,
question. Oh.
sorry, to what you were saying, Julian, just that we, our editor-in-chief who writes blogs more regularly than we've had in the past. And so it's kind of a way of being transparent about some of the approaches and decision making. But we do refer more now to the 360-degree view, instead of the both sides. And that is what you're talking about, the coverage over time and through. If we have a topic page, for example, where we have every single thing we've done on this story. And if you look at it, like you say, it's not all of it dealt with in each piece, but over time, the scope of the coverage, that's where the balance lies.
Next question, Ange. I just got a brief hello from Akram. He just says the internet connection is down. So I am trying to text with him. I'll keep you posted. Live from Gaza, as they say. Ange, next question.
Yeah, the next question is for you, Julian. In his introduction, Jim mentioned that you have trained journalists widely in the Middle East and have done documentaries there. From your engagement with Middle Eastern journalists, can you give us some additional sense of the challenges that they face in open war zones like Gaza, or in zones of lower level but persistent violence, like in the West Bank or southern Lebanon, Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, the Kurdish regions in southeast Turkey?
Wow. Okay. I don't usually take questions as the moderator. It's a good question. Let me deal with two aspects. Akram just said he tried, but the connection is very bad. I might ask him a couple of quick questions and relate to you by text. So let me just quickly answer and then get back to him. I can imagine what Akram has gone through. Even though I haven't been in many open battles, I have trained journalists in war zones, and I have been in war zones: Baghdad, Afghanistan, Somalia. I filmed in the West Bank, stories on the tensions between settlers and Palestinians. And you're trying to do your job. You're often wearing a bulletproof vest. But it's difficult when you realize you have to risk your life. But what's even more striking, and Gideon made this point, Gideon might receive a lot of hate mail. He at one point had to have bodyguards, but he is living in a democracy where people might strongly disagree with him. The problem is that many journalists I have trained throughout the Middle East are not dealing and are not living in democracies. So Akram has to worry about his life every day. But even if there was no fighting going on, if you have regions, and Gideon mentioned several of them, where there is absolutely either no democracy or huge repression and lack of freedom, it's amazing the courage I have found among Arab journalists and their willingness to get the story out. We don't hear a lot about that because a lot of it is not in English, but they're doing a vital role in getting the stories out right now from Lebanon, Beirut, Yemen, all through the Arab world. Let's take a next question. And while we're doing that, because we still have a little while, I am going to try to text some questions to Akram and let you know what he says.
Okay, the next question is from Sydney. And Sydney asks, how do you know which sources to trust regarding events in Gaza? Are on-the-ground journalists or bloggers objective sources? Are they free from Hamas pressure?
Tracy, good question, and it relates to
really good question.
your work you're doing with your freelancer and others. Take it away.
Yeah, I mean, with our freelancer, we are in direct communication with him about everything that he's gathering, and we need to make sure that we know as much about our sources as we can know, and if we don't know enough, we seek others. It's complicated, it's hard, but we just have to do due diligence, every single story, every detail, every day.
Let me just mention a good example to look at if people want is BBC has a team called BBC Verify. And what they will often do, it's worth looking at their website. They will look at social media or even news reports, whether it's accusations of an Israeli attack or accusations of repression or other activities in the Arab world. And they will go through the pictures or the statements and try to show where video has been manipulated or where it is wrong. And that's new to have a special squad that does that. Tracy?
We do. Sorry, we do. We don't have the size of the squad that the BBC has, but we have started doing verification work as well. We did have a particular expert on staff who we are still working with on a freelance basis, who does have a really high level of verification skill, and we're building that within CBC as well. It's a work in progress, but I mean, and a lot of it is, roll up your sleeves kind of old-fashioned journalism. But there are some really specified skills, and we are building on those. Again, not to the same degree that the BBC is able to do, but it's definitely vital to be doing that. And certainly at various times of this war, we needed to be really on top of verifying whether images could be used or not.
Gideon, on this topic, I believe in a recent column you talked about, I think it was Al Jazeera who first reported the story of Palestinians, I think they were handcuffed, being used as kind of dogs inside the tunnels to see if there was any danger. And then I believe it was denied, but then Haaretz did its investigation. Can you talk about that as an example of a story that seems hard to believe was denied, but was since proven true?
First of all, it shows the important role of Al Jazeera, because Al Jazeera was the first one to publish it. Israel is using dogs in many occasions in Gaza. In particular, they're sending them with cameras into tunnels to see what's going on. They are well trained also to smell explosives and also to attack. There were dozens of dogs killed in operation. And Israel is lacking dogs, and then we found something which is cheaper than a dog. And this is Palestinian lives. Not that I'm in favor of sending dogs to the death, by all means not. But Israel chose Palestinians to be sub-dogs. Yeah, the Germans call the Jews Untermensch. Now we can call those Palestinians who were sent into tunnels Unter dogs. And this is obviously a crime of war. It's a kind of human shields. One was already killed in such an operation. And those things must be published. And that's exactly what the Israeli media does not want to publish, and the Israeli viewers and readers don't want to know. And if you publish it, you are a traitor. You are accused in treason. But that's exactly the role of journalists, especially in the middle of the war, not after the war. In the middle of the war, when things can change. And those who can live in peace with it, that Israeli soldiers are picking up randomly Palestinians, sending them into the tunnels when they are handicapped, with a camera on their body, without any way to protect them and any intention to protect them. Is this human? Is this legal? Is this moral? And above all, you might think that there is no other choice but doing it. You might think that Jewish life is much more expensive than Palestinian life. All okay, but you have to know that those things are being done. To avoid disinformation is out of the question. First, the facts, and then do with it whatever you want. One will go to The Hague, and the other one will salute to those soldiers. But all of us have to know, and all of us journalists have to report such cases. And this is what the military correspondent of ours did.
And just to be clear, this was first reported by Al Jazeera Arabic, I imagine, because they are in Gaza, and it was denied by the authorities. And
Right.
then because of that, Haaretz did its own investigation.
I don't know if because of this, but we brought many more evidences on a much wider scale. And above all, what is very important in our investigation is that everyone knows about it until the highest ranks in the army. It's not like it was a local partisan initiative. It is a procedure which goes on ever since Israel is in Gaza, and all the commanders until the chief of staff know about it. And our correspondent brought proofs that everyone knows about it and does nothing to stop it, even though it's a clear crime of war. There are no doubt about it.
Unbelievable. Let me just, I feel like I'm a news reader here, but direct from Gaza, from Khan Yunis, from Akram, whose internet is down, but he can text me. He says, I'm quoting now, continuous bombardments. 2 houses were targeted right where he is. He says, many people under the rubble. I'm still talking with him, so I will fill you in as we hear from him. A little close to home for him. Ange, next question.
Yeah, the next question is for Gideon. Netanyahu and Gvir have been enabling settlements and have been attempting to engage in judicial subsumptions into the executive branch, breaching the division of powers. How widespread is the settlement movement into the media environment and broader society in Israel? Does that influence the reporting on the war by mainstream media? Do you think that should the government fall, there will be a widespread culture change in that component, or do you think that it will stay?
Very good question. The settlers, and we are dealing with 700,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank, are not only 700,000 settlers. They are the most well-organized, the most powerful political group in Israelis politics. They are blackmailing all the governments, government after government. Now, obviously, they have much more space to do so because Netanyahu totally depends on them. And they are now getting really wild because they have the great opportunity. One of them said that this war is a miracle for them, because that's the time for really getting all kind of achievements, or what they call achievements. Now, in a very clever way, sophisticated way, many years ago, they started to send settlers to all kind of influential places, centers. One of them was the legal system. The other one is the army. Many high officers are from the settlements. In many ways, they replaced the officers from the kibbutzim in former years, and also to the media. And today, they are everywhere in very influential positions. The settlers and their supporters. And yes, it has an influence on the narrative, it has an influence on the discourse, because they are so powerful and because they are selling a narrative that the Israelis like to hear. They have also their own media outlets, which are becoming more and more influential in Israel. Channel 14, which gives a fight to all the other channels. And it's a real hardcore right-wing settlers TV station. And it's becoming more and more popular among many Israelis, mainly young Israelis. The more disappointing part of my answer will be that I don't see that those things will change if the government will be replaced by another government. And this one should know and not be mistaken. All the other candidates, the possible candidates to replace Netanyahu, are critical about him, are less corrupted than him, are more maybe human than him. None of them opposes the occupation, none of them opposes the apartheid, and none of them is ready to put an end to the war in Gaza. So don't expect too much.
Ange, next question. That was a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, the next question, the attendees, first of all, thanks everyone for this really interesting conversation. And then they say, I'm sure you know the pro-Israel group Honest Reporting and the pressure it puts on Canadian media and journalists. I have two questions, one for Tracy and one for Gideon. Tracy, how does it impact CBC and how do you protect your journalists? Gideon, what do you think about their strategy and how we should react to this?
Thank you for the question. A very good question. We respond to Honest Reporting when there are complaints sent through the ombudsman process in the way that we always respond to complaints. And we do, we don't always involve our journalists in every single one of the complaints. We always, know the background of their stories, but it can be, it's hard. I think it's really important that the complaints come through the complaints process. That's where we need to be held accountable and not our individual journalists. So it's a challenging question. I think that's all I can say is that we really try to be responsive to complaints and defend our journalism. We do tell our journalists, like, people don't have to be, they just need to be focusing on being accurate and getting the story right. And don't worry about complaints. We'll deal with complaints. If you've got the story right, you do that, and we will deal with complaints. But it is hard when people are personally targeted from any group, and so I would say that one we're still trying to figure out how to better protect our journalists.
Gideon?
Yes, I'll be very clear. Israeli and Jewish propaganda system took a very sophisticated strategic decision a few years ago. It didn't start now. Namely, to label any criticism of Israel or of the occupation, to label it as anti-Semitism. And it is a hell of a success. Europe is paralyzed. Voices are silenced. People don't dare to raise their voice because they are afraid to be labeled as anti-Semitism. Who wants to be labeled as an anti-Semite? Any criticism about Israel is immediately labeled as anti-Semitism. The International Court of Justice is an anti-Semitic institution. The Criminal Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, is anti-Semitic. The judges, everyone there is anti-Semite, is an anti-Semite. The media is anti-Semitic, and obviously the politicians. I think it became a problem of freedom of speech in Europe and also in the United States and Canada, but mainly in Europe, not only. I think it's really a problem of democracy. And I expect more voices to stand against it. You know, they are anti-Semites and they should be fought, but not any criticism on Israel is anti-Semitic. On the contrary, most of the criticism about Israel comes from people of conscience who cannot see, who cannot keep silent when you see Gaza. And to label them as anti-Semites is a very sophisticated strategy, because all of a sudden it's not Israel's fault, it's the world's fault. The world is anti-Semite. What do you want from us? We are just looking for peace and justice. So it's about time not to surrender, because until now, I saw it also in the United States and Canada, but especially in Europe, media outlets surrendered. They are really paralyzed by this accusation that they might be labeled as anti-Semites. And I think it's about time to say, nobody will tell us who is an anti-Semite and who is not. We know very well who is an anti-Semite and who is a person of conscience. And you cannot label people of conscience as anti-Semites. Yeah, Roger Waters is an anti-Semite. I know him so well, and I spend with him so much time. There's not 1 gram of anti-Semitism in his veins. He's an extreme critic of Israel. I think anyone of conscience should be a critic of Israel right now. But the media should not surrender to this manipulation, because it is a manipulation, a very cynical manipulation.
And next.
Yeah, there's been several related questions for Tracy, so just to combine them. The first is asking what she thinks of the Canadian media organizations, the breach, and I'm quoting, expose on the lack of space for pro-Palestinian voices and journalists who are critical of Israel at the CBC. The related question is whether, and again, I'm quoting, you feel pressure from different sources not to present information critical of Israel by financial contributors, advertisers, or lobbyists?
No, we don't feel any of that kind of pressure. I feel like, you know, I mean, certainly not advertising type. I mean, we are the public broadcaster, so there are some things that we don't get as pressures that other private media organizations might. Lobby groups, we aren't influenced. People try to influence our reporting, but we really try to protect our journalists to be able to tell it like they see it, our field journalists. And inside the newsroom, the breach stories, I mean, our editor-in-chief, again, I think responded in one case for sure. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but I think that we allow people, we're trying to build an environment where the discussion and debate is happening inside the newsroom, and where we are disagreeing inside the newsroom and figuring things out, sharing different perspectives, and not in a place like the breach, not being critical of the breach, but I will just say I would rather that we were having some of those disagreements internally, and that our journalism would be stronger if we could just debate and disagree and discuss here first. But I understand that it's easy for me to say that in a way as well. And we've certainly heard from people from various perspectives that they don't feel safe, inside the newsroom to speak up. So I recognize that that we're dealing with, as we were talking about earlier, a really difficult situation, and we're just constantly working on it. Did that answer your question?
It's a tough question and a good answer. Let me say that, especially for those outside Canada who may not know the breach, I think perhaps I will suggest to Jim and Ange that tomorrow, when this is posted, we can post links to their articles, and also, as Tracy said, the response by Brody Fenlon and other parts of his editor's blog. Let me also say that I've always felt, and I've always told this to colleagues that I used to work with, is that we can't be tough-headed journalists that take on the powerful, be it prime ministers or business elites or war criminals around the world, and then have thin skin when it comes to attacks. All power, I say, to groups of whatever political persuasion who want to criticize CBC, Haaretz, or anybody. That's fine. That's the beauty of democracy. I think what's important, as both panelists have said, is that the criticism has to be political, and it has to be directed at the institution and not personal, much less violent attacks on journalists, as we have seen both in the United States, some horrific racism in Canada and around the world. Let me use that as a segue to go back to our correspondent in Gaza. He's not our correspondent, but he's our correspondent on the panel. Akram texts, as you know, keeping you up to date, he said 2 houses were targeted near him, many people on the rubble. Then he gets more details. I asked him, are you going to be reporting on this? Keep in mind that it is almost 11 o'clock there at night. He said several Gazans were killed and wounded when a house was bombed of the Al-Shair family in the Kizan al-Najir area south of Khan Yunis, south of the Gaza Strip. And then I asked him, how do you keep your head together when you see such destruction around you? How do you stay dispassionate, or try to stay dispassionate, as a journalist? And let me quote his words directly. The entire situation is inconceivable. I cried in this war more than I did in my entire life. At least he's safe so far. Ange, we have about 8 more minutes if we land up wrapping by 4 o'clock our time. Ange, next question.
Yeah, the next question is for Gideon. It's from Rohan. And Rohan was the one who asked the settlement question. So Rohan is asking, just wanted to know your thoughts on the counting of civilian deaths, given that Hamas does not distinguish between civilian and combatant deaths. What is the best way to keep numbers, especially given competing claims on accurate counts? And especially when considering that Hamas interests are served when civilians die on either side, and their failed rocket launches using people as shields.
We don't have another source but Hamas Health Ministry, and I don't feel that anyone proved that their figures are wrong. I mean, it's 10 months now, and if there would have been entire different figures, I'm sure they would have shown up. Nobody really, including not the IDF spokesperson, is denying their figures. Now, there are some facts which are undeniable. The fact is that the majority of the killed people, are 70%, I think, are children and women. Nobody can accuse them as terrorists. So, isn't it enough? We know, according to all the figures, that around 10,000 children were killed. Does it really matter if it's 9,500 or 10,700? Imagine yourself, 10,000 children killed. Those who try to put some doubts about the figures want to say the whole story is wrong. But I claim that it doesn't matter if they are wrong in 10% or 20%. Nobody thinks that there were only 100 children killed in this war, yeah? So does it really matter? But until now, we don't have another source. We are in the middle of the war. There are thousands of people still under the rubble. So in any case, the figures will be much bigger later on. And it's enough from what we know to be shocked, to try to stop it by now, because whatever the source is, the figures are devastating.
On that somber but important note, I'd like to thank our panelists, Gideon Levy from Haaretz and Tracy Seeley from CBC. Also, Akram, who continues to, at great risk to himself, report from his darkened tent about the destruction he is seeing. And maybe at some future time, hopefully, perhaps a little more peaceful time, we can revisit with these three panelists and we could hear directly from Akram and look towards a future where there could be better and more inspiring reporting from a very, very dangerous region. Thank you all, and over to Jim.
Well, I want to join Julian in thanking you, Gideon and Tracy, for a really engaging discussion. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us and our audience today. And as was mentioned earlier in the program, the video of this panel will be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow, along with links to various resources if you want to read more or see more about the issues that were discussed. So our website is cfe.torontomu.ca. Our next event is going to be in 3 weeks on September 17th. It's a Tuesday at 7 p.m. And we're turning to a Canadian issue. Yeah, the title of the event is Freedom of Expression, Protests, and Encampments. What can we learn from what happened on Canadian and Quebec campuses? And we've assembled quite a remarkable panel of some of the leading legal experts in the country on these issues and the application of the Charter to universities. One is Jamie Cameron, who is Professor Emerita for Constitutional Law at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. The second is Sarah Hamill, who is an Assistant Professor of Law at Trinity College Dublin and has written on issues related to those adjudicated in the encampments. The third is Louis-Philippe Lampron, Professor of Law at Université Laval. And the final panelist is Finn Makla, Professor of Law at the University of Sherbrooke. So I hope you'll join us on September 17th, Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information on any of our panels, both those that are upcoming and the many videos of previous panels, including ones related to the issues discussed today, go to our website again, cfe.torontomu.ca. Thank you very much for attending today.